Hello, this is the introduction to parts 1 and 2 of mini lectures on RCRA and CERCLA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and Superfund. Please excuse the shaking of the video. I did not realize how much my hands shake because of the app that I'm using to record this. And as you will notice, when a video focuses on my face, it shakes more. Once the video transitions to the slides, it should not be too difficult, but I would recommend looking away or not looking at the video while I am on the screen. The second thing is, I originally expected only to have one lecture on this. Turns out the lecture went longer, and so I've split it up into two. So the first part is a mini lecture on RCRA, about 15 minutes long, and the second part is a lecture on CERCLA, almost 30 minutes long. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to the mini lecture on Superfund, or also more technically referred to as CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, with a little bit of an introduction to RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that I will start out with. Now, just to provide a little bit of context, why introduce and address or cover Superfund this early in the course? And that's really quite a simple reason. Superfund, I think in my view, is closest in its approach to environmental issues to the common law, in that it focuses on liability and compensation as both a preventive mechanism as well as a deterrent mechanism, as well as a form of remediation to environmental harms. Some of the concepts here translate directly from the common law doctrines that you've already seen in our discussion of nuisance and abnormally dangerous activities and others. But also, and that of course in some ways is not different from some of the other environmental statutes which import common law principles. But I think it is an appropriate transition for us to go from common law approaches, liability-based approaches, sort of adjudication of things that have already gone wrong, to preventative mechanisms. And it's also going to be an introduction for us to environmental justice, which started out in many respects focused on problems of hazardous waste disposal, of contamination that has really affected minority and other marginalized, low-income population the most or most severely. Now, before we can get into Superfund, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about RCRA. Right? RCRA is our statute that focuses on hazardous waste and also on other types of garbage disposals. Ordinarily, I would spend much more time on this. It's a really comprehensive regulatory scheme. But given that we have to make some choices about coverage, and I'd like to do other things, including cover the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in more detail, this is one of those areas that has to be cut somewhat. But I didn't want to move forward without giving you some sort of sense of the issues, especially because some of the disposal issues and what is defined as waste is actually quite relevant, of course, to CERCLA and Superfund. All right, let me go to my slides. And of course, this is intended as a quick overview, not as a substitute for the reading, but I hope that this will help answer some questions that might have come up in your reading of the materials. Okay, this is the reading. Note, by the way, that our discussion of the, cases, Shore versus New York versus Shore Realty and Burlington Northern versus US will come as separate mini lectures that I'll provide separately. All right, so before getting into the Solid Waste Disposal Act or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, before we get into Superfund, I want to touch briefly on RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and oftentimes it's also wrapped together with the Solid Waste Disposal Act. The Solid Waste Disposal Act deals with non-hazardous waste, subtitle D, whereas RCRA is subtitle C that deals with the hazardous components of waste. What I want to touch on briefly is what is the purpose of it, and structure of the act, how is RCRA a departure from the common law, and what is the scope of regulation. And the purpose is really quite straightforward, of course. It deals with the broader issue of waste disposal as it's affected interstate commerce, and that's become really not just a local problem, but a national or interstate problem. We won't get into those cases, but certainly over the decades, states have attempted to deal with waste dump site issues, filling up of garbage dumps by simply exporting their garbage. And so that is in part where the rationale for these issues or the connection to congressional legislation comes out of. But as you can tell, this is dealing with waste, of course, a broader issue. Hazardous waste, of course, is also a particular subset of these issues, and particularly implicates interstate commerce issues in that there is really a national market and national disposal processes, I would say. Hazardous waste rarely gets disposed of locally, in part because of economies of scale, in part because of regulation and the like. And therefore, regulating the interstate movement and really how things are dealt with, ensuring that they're dealt with safely and consistently across the country is really an important policy objective of the environmental statutes of RCRA. Right? So that's the broader issue, creating these standards. One other thing to note, by the way, is that mostly local municipal garbage, municipal solid waste, that is household garbage, is largely not regulated by the EPA. EPA has set standards for how solid waste landfills should be constructed, but those are largely voluntary standards. It's a voluntary program that was supported by EPA with funding and advice and guidance. It's really the hazardous waste that has involved the EPA with regard to sort of a mandatory regulatory set of requirements or regulations. And that's really primarily what I'm going to talk about in the next minute or so. Really just a very quick overview. RCRA is a fairly comprehensive statute. It's designed and oftentimes is referred to as a cradle to grave, a program where hazardous waste is tracked and categorized and essentially a piece of paper becomes attached to hazardous once it's generated, and it's essentially tracked while it is managed and disposed of until its final resting place at some sort of hazardous waste site or for processing. Hazardous, what is hazardous? What is the scope of coverage, right? Section 1004, subsection 5 defines hazardous waste as a solid waste or combination of solid waste which, because of its quantity, concentration of physical, chemical, or infectious characteristics, may cause increased mortality and illness, or pose other substantial present or potential hazards to human health and the environment when improperly treated, stored, transported, and disposed of. Right. So here, right away, you get the rationale here. This is really a statute designed to protect the environment and human health, and what it defines, or what it does to define hazardous waste, is by reference to another term that is solid waste, which will come to, as you can see in the slide below, has a separate definition. But the test for hazardous waste is both based on its hazardous characteristics, physical, chemical, infectious characteristics. Something that may be not hazardous in small quantity may become so when large quantities are involved, or something else is changed to it, and it becomes reactive, combustible, all sorts of other things, right? We won't get into all of that, but that's really just a sort of quick note here of what raises concerns. It is defined in reference to solid waste under Section 1004, subsection 27, which refers to solid waste as any form of garbage, refuse, sludge, or any other discarded material, including solid, liquid, semi-solid, contained gaseous material from industrial, commercial, mining, agricultural operations. Right? You can tell here it's a very, very broad, encompassing a definition here. The reason for including contained gaseous material, so it's not necessarily just air emissions, but contained air emission is designed to capture things that can be handled, right? That are not right away released into the environment as might occur with a smokestack. And then the other part here to note is that reference here to discarded materials here. That's really quite important because that's a issue that's been heavily litigated because it really is a threshold question of whether a substance is still a raw material or a usable product and has crossed over into something that is garbage or waste. Right? It is also a definition or term that comes up in CERCLA because it then, of course, is captured under RCRA and CERCLA. If it is not discarded, RCRA does not, by the way, and our environmental laws here, the waste laws, do not address products or raw materials, right? That's really important to remember here. And that's why the definition of discarded is so important. One of the issues that comes up right away in terms of this threshold question is when it becomes discarded. And particularly the problem of recycling and reuse that's become so significant these days when we're trying to reduce waste. Secondary materials, how to essentially deal with the process of recycling and especially sham recycling. When operations are designed to, quote, look like recycling when they really are disposal operations and they store things for an indefinite period of time, purportedly for future recycling, for future reuse, but when that reuse never comes. And of course, in the process, the materials then leak into the ground and present all of the dangers and problems for why we have these waste management laws in the first place. The other issue is, of course, in addition to determining sham materials, there's actually one really important recycling operation that always applies, and that really represents, and that has been dealt with in part, but always potentially represents an issue, and that is any kind of material represents some form of energy that can be recovered, right? So anything can be incinerated, and the energy that went into the production of that, the manufacturing of that product can be recovered. And one might say that is a form of recycling, not necessarily the physical substance, but rather of the energy that's been put in. In large part, that is actually not acceptable. That's not deemed to be a form of recycling, and has not been acceptable to keep it outside of the disposal line. Right. So this slide here, I won't get into this here. Just describes here of what might be raises these recycling issues. I also want to point out the particular regulatory and statutory exceptions to what is deemed to be solid waste and therefore what is not regulated, including things that are captured under some of the other pollution control laws, such as the water pollution, air pollution, and nuclear materials. And there are also regulatory exemptions for household waste, just garbage. When you dispose of batteries or waste oil or other things, or other household cleaners, that is actually hazardous waste. But by regulation, your garbage company does not have to treat it as garbage hazardous waste. If the question that you immediately ask why, it's simply administrative convenience, administrative management decision that has been made. It would be impossible really to sort out, or not impossible, but very impractical, and would dramatically increase the cost. And EPA and the federal government essentially has made the judgment call that it's not that it's not worth it, or that it raises too many other issues here of imposing regulations on individuals. But note here that that is not
an unresolved issue. You could imagine in the future EPA or even Congress going back and attempting to revisit this issue. Agricultural waste are also accepted, and also high volume waste, what I refer to as bevel or Benson waste. During mining, a lot of overburden, a lot of material gets generated, and it's essentially waste. It gets put aside, and it actually presents real problem, and it's been actually an ongoing issue on how to deal with a lot of that. All right, that is my sort of quick take at RCRA. I'm looking at the time, and we're almost at 15 minutes already. So let me do this. Let me split this mini lecture up into two pieces, and I'm going to come back and start with CERCLA as part 2 of this mini lecture. Okay.